واحد فلوس.
So actually, I'll present you actually, and you present Aaron, and you will present also. Because there has been a change actually, and actually he's going to replace Hassan Salah. Okay, fantastic.
How to improve.
Yes. Okay. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure actually to co-chair this session with Professor Mahmoud Midan from Al-Azhar University, Dumyat, and Dr. Edgar Mocano from Ireland. And actually, we'll start to the session by having our dear guest, Dr. Edgar Mocano. And Dr. Edgar actually is a practitioner and educator. He's a specialist in obstetric gynecology, an RCOG certified subspecialist in reproductive medicine and surgery, and a consultant at the Rotunda Hospital, the authentic oldest maternity hospital in the whole of Europe. So he's going to address us on first point of fertility care, a global healthcare system duty. Please, Edgar.
Chair, thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. A pleasure being here. Thank you to the Egyptian Fertility and Sterility Society for the invitation to talk. First point of fertility care, a healthcare system duty, was the title. I would like to talk today about maybe first point of fertility care, a paradigm shift. I have no conflict of interest to declare. I would like to cover three topics. One is reproductive trends, reproductive health education, and opportunities for improvement. I'm sure you all might be aware that there are a lot of people around the world that are not able to have a child after 5 years of trying. And there's no more reliable source than the World Bank. This is a report from 12 years ago, estimating approximately 100 million couples worldwide are infertile after 5 years. And it comes to no shock to realize that the age of first birth across Europe at least is increasing constantly. And you can see only countries from the Central Europe like Romania and Bulgaria that still have respectable female ages at the first birth, while the Western developed part of Europe is moving fast over the 30 years old age for the first delivery. And I might go very fast through these three slides I have here, but just to stress out that the paler the world is, the lower the fertility rate. And if you're not impressed, I'll do it again. This is 1985, 2010, and 2030 estimated. And the replacement rate is the very pale yellow, which is now overwhelmingly present across the planet. And if you believe that one source is not good, you can seek different sources of information, and the picture is very similar. This source, Our World in Data, shows very clearly, you can move the cursor, if you go on that website, you can move the cursor from 1541 to, believe it or not, 2019, and you can see how different the fertility rate, children per woman, is between 1956 and 2019. And I might just call that fertility anemia. I wouldn't call it a global fertility anemia, but you can see from the red of the 5, 4, and 6 children per woman to now 2 children per woman. And we all have to acknowledge the need for fertility care is increasing globally, yet the awareness of reproductive reality is very poor. And we can blame many things for this lack of awareness. And here are just some important words that come to mind: birth control, contraception, so on and so forth. But they cannot take the blame for everything. Nevertheless, there's a poor understanding of fact, and there's a lot of misinterpretation in terms of what is the true ability to conceive later in life. And this lack of education goes beyond early school. There's good evidence that even students, and I'm sure a lot of you are teaching medical students these days, and I could say it honestly, how many times we're discussing with our medical students presenting fertility facts, and we can see their stupefaction on their faces when you might tell them you only have 400 eggs in your life, or 400 days when you can get pregnant. And if our medical students are not aware of that, what can we expect from other students? So we should not be surprised that the total fertility rate by 2045 across the globe, the world is the blue line, the less developed regions are in green, and the Western world are well below the replacement rate, but the whole world will be reaching the value of fertility rate of 2, which is below replacement rate. So we have to acknowledge that at present, contraception education is not balanced by fertility education, that effective adolescent, student, and young adult education on fertility is lacking. And we need to ask ourselves, why is scientific knowledge not widely disseminated? Dante Alighieri, many years ago, said, if the present world goes astray, the cause is in you. In you it is to be thought, also the solution. So what to do? We need to start thinking differently. How can we deliver care to our infertile patients, and start a discussion on how global fertility practitioner community can connect and learn together. The current way of thinking is how to create access to care for all in need. But I might ask the question, can you raise up your hands if you believe your country or the place you work has all the resources to provide fertility care for everybody in need? Who believes this is the case? Why don't we try to think differently? How to educate on matters of human fertility might be more appropriate for the present. Because, ladies and gentlemen, I might challenge everybody, and including myself, and say that education is the start of care. Would educated young adults make different decisions in terms of their reproduction? And why not use existing resources to deliver such care? The fertility services tiers are well established. The first point of fertility care, which might be a general practitioner in the developed countries, or even a small hospital, regional hospital. Secondary services in larger hospitals, and tertiary services where all facilities are available, including ART. And do we know truly what is the gap between services offered and the need at global level? I'm not aware of such a resource yet. But many times we look at the right side of the slide as our competition, as our enemy. And may I just draw your attention, they provide different services. They first provide contraceptive education. They will tell you everything about every single drug that you can use or intervention you can use to prevent a pregnancy. And then they will introduce the care. And of course, they do have tiered services, including tubal ligation in general hospitals and so on. So what if the two opposing ends, the yin and yangs of reproduction, will come together to create a foundation for first point of contraception and fertility education first and care, hopefully, subsequently. The strengths of such a strange idea lie in using the existing resources, rich resources, I might say, afforded by the contraceptive fraternity. Things like significant infrastructure, expertise, audit channels. I have no doubt that now you can interrogate databases and know how many people use contraception around the world and what is the current need for it. There's no such resource in terms of fertility. And of course, there could be the possibility of seeking some common funding. The contraceptive fraternity has $4 billion a year at their disposal. I might also say that there is the opportunity for continuity and building trust. If the first point of education is the contraceptive fertility unit, in that situation when you need further advice later, you already know the people that have provided you the initial advice. And before you might think that all this is pie in the sky, I might just draw your attention to this paper which was published in 2013 from a group in Uppsala. They asked a very simple question. If we educate students that attend for contraception and randomize the student group that is educated and presented with a particular document, which I'll describe in a moment, and the others are only provided fertility advice, contraceptive advice, how can we influence their behavior? This thing called a reproductive life plan is mainly related to both contraception and fertility. So the population of students, the two interventions. This is the reproductive life plan that says, you probably can't see very well, but have you thought about your reproductive life plan? First question. Do you plan to have more or children in your life? If no, how do you prevent pregnancy? If yes, how many children do you want to have? When would you like to become pregnant again? If within a short period of time, how do you prepare for pregnancy? And if later, how do you plan to preserve your fertility? And of course, how do you plan to prevent becoming pregnant until then? And then, if maybe or don't know, the questions will be, what are your thoughts on having children? From your point of view, what speaks in favor of or against having children? And how do you plan to prevent becoming pregnant again until you have decided? And this is just focusing the mind of a student on matters of fertility and, of course, contraception. So these are the control group. The intervention group received this piece of information that said as follows: at the top, reproduction in general. At the age, this was just information. At the age of 35, there's a marked decline in women's ability to become pregnant, and the risk for pregnancy complication increases. Second, since an ovum lives approximately 1 day and sperm 5 days, you have 5 days in a menstrual cycle when you can become pregnant. If the woman is younger than 25, the likelihood of becoming pregnant at the time of ovulation between 30 and 35. They talked about factors that can affect fertility, like old age, sexually transmitted infections, diseases, hereditary factors, stress, unhealthy lifestyles. And then they talked about preventive reproduction, things like taking folic acid, avoiding alcohol, avoiding tobacco, avoiding toxic, harmful substances or exposures, beautifully illustrated just in the previous talk, and avoid being either under or overweight. This is a study on students that attend for contraception, yes? And then the last one was the problems with reproduction. And what they were told was that 1 out of 4 women who undergo IVF will become pregnant. So what they did was they took an initial questionnaire from all of them to probe their understanding of both contraception and fertility. They provided this information to them, and they followed up with a second questionnaire 1 month later. And it should be to no surprise that in the beginning, there's no difference between groups regarding the mean fertility knowledge. But yet, after the education, we could see clearly the intervention group scored far higher compared to the others. And furthermore, from a reproductive perspective, at follow-up, more women in the intervention group, the ones that were educated about fertility, wished to have their last child, not their first child, but their last child earlier in life. So shouldn't we realize that the contraception fraternity is offering us a solution? That providing a fertility questionnaire and advice at the time of contraceptive counseling ensures balanced education. We could, for example, discuss things like when to have a child, what to do to become pregnant, how does a pregnancy establish, when to seek help early. There are many women that at this moment in time can be screened for serious medical backgrounds that will reduce their likelihood to conceive naturally later. And they are the primary candidates for help and support when they decide to have a family, as opposed to saying, wait for 12 months, don't worry about having had chemotherapy, you're absolutely fine. And of course, where can help be found if not pregnant? So, ladies and gentlemen, I would suggest that the future might lie in the contraceptive services expanding into providing fertility education for all attending for contraception. And that the first point of reproductive education can become also the first layer of fertility investigations delivered by fertility-trained doctors, nurses, and students. Truly, women are having only 1 or 2 children. They are far more educated now than 20, 30 years ago. Also, these women are the ones that use contraception as young adults. And I think the opportunity presents to serve both sides of the coin at the right time. Contraception and fertility education until fertility desired, and then fertility care if a pregnancy does not establish. And if you believe the resources are not there, have a look at this graph. Demand for family planning satisfied. This is not what is the demand. This is the demand is fulfilled in the world in 1984 and 2019. These centers and these services are everywhere on the planet. I think there are some weaknesses. Fertility care now is a catch-up exercise. We're trying to help where nature said no, and we're trying to portray ourselves as being able to do so perfectly, and I think that's a mistake. The opportunity lies in starting a dialogue and proposing a partnership for balanced reproductive education, true preventative reproduction. I can see no reason why the one point of reproductive care, and I might have taken you on a long road to this slide, but I can see no reason why the one point or the first point of reproductive care, educating young generation, is a common ground between contraceptive education, fertility education, and then lately care for the infertile. The threat is that the contraception fraternity will seize the opportunity and take away our expertise and place it under their care, because they have the infrastructure, they have all the money, they have the people, they're perceived, and they are a not-for-profit global group, and they're operating even in times of crisis. And if you follow up how the pandemic happened and the continuous support for this activity, you'll realize that fertility care will go down in any time of crisis, including a financial crisis, but the contraception care will not go down. Furthermore, and I'm finishing, I have 2 more slides, the United Nations Development Goals clearly say that by 2030, the globe, the world, the governments should ensure universal access to sexual and reproductive health care, including family planning, information, and education. Education. We're not looking for treatment, we're looking for education. And of course, the integration into national strategies. So, as families will have probably one, maximum two children, I would like to leave you with this thought. He was a famous man that stemmed from the shores of the fertile Nile. And he had a vision, and I might just stress out that this is not a document or a say that is a paper one. This is a WHO bulletin, as official as it can get. And he said, in a world that needs vigorous control of population growth, we accept that. Concerns about infertility may seem odd, but the adoption of a small family norm makes the issue of involuntary infertility more pressing. If couples are urged to postpone or widely space pregnancies, we know now it's better to leave a bit of time, it is imperative that they should be helped to achieve pregnancy when they so decide, in the more limited time they will have available. What foresight! And we need to actually use this as one reason to propose such a come together between all groups. I love this poster from April 19 that said that the health of the child is the power of the nation. I don't really, I'm not a proponent of so many children in one family, so don't take me wrong. And to finish, I would like to remind you that the International Federation of Fertility Societies has their World Congress in September next year, not far away, only a flight away in Athens, so please feel free to join us for science. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Edgar, for this actually very interesting presentation, and the presentation is open for discussion. Yes, Professor Saru.
Thank you very much, Edgar, for this excellent presentation. And thank you also very much for reminding us of the wisdom of Professor Mahmoud Fathallah, our mentor, with this statement. And actually, he used this to convince WHO when he was the director of the HRP to include infertility in the HRP program. Before that, they wouldn't talk about it. And then eventually we could get it through during the past 6 or 7 years, and now WHO is concerned with infertility. And we are using the same thought you are mentioning in our own university. I work in a very conservative university, the Al-Azhar University, and it happened that I'm currently the director of International Islamic Center for Population Studies and Research. So it is for population studies and research, for family planning, for spacing of pregnancy, for women's health, etc. But to convince the higher authorities of the university and to get their support, I included infertility in the program of the center. And we established a training program in infertility, and then IVF program, and then master degrees and diploma degrees in infertility and assisted reproduction. And that's how the way it should go. I fully agree with you that we should use the infrastructure which we have for the propagation of the management of infertility, which is very supportive for family planning program. Thank you very much for this excellent talk.
Actually, I would like to have your comments actually about the obstacles for this. And as you mentioned, actually, that in the time of the crisis, particularly in the COVID-19 epidemic, actually, there has been two things. Actually, people were talking about the promotion of contraception, because actually people would not like actually to have a surplus of another increase in the fertility rates. And at the same time, there has been a drop as well to the use of fertility service. And I mean, at one point, actually, this was politically driven, and this is one of the obstacles. I would like to have you comment about that. And the other thing, actually, that we are witnessing now, that the socioeconomic status are getting actually on the way of promoting such a fertility awareness and educational aspects, where actually women, for example, in our societies are couldn't have actually their desired time of getting pregnant except within marriages, which is actually becoming delayed at a later age. And this is actually, I think that Professor Fathallah was referring to, that we need to help them at the expected time of their wishes to attend the fertility And the last thing, actually, the professional commitment as well. That's becoming another obstacle for women actually to achieve their desired actually fertility. Yes, please.
I start with the last one. I have to come back and give a talk on that if you want. If you look at employment globally, since the 1920s, men are going down a little bit, and women have gone up constantly. There's no time to have a baby. There's no time to even look after a baby because you want to be educated. So when should we start? I still think we should start there when we see our adolescents in contraceptive facilities or contraception, and we give them the information and say, hey, this is what you need to do now. This is the time not to become pregnant. You are young, you want to have a career, you want to be educated and so on, but don't leave it till you're 46 and come to the fertility specialist expecting you'll get pregnant. Too late. And I think that's one. There are barriers. First question, there are barriers, and they are significant. And I think it's a matter of perception. I think the two groups have not sat down to understand that, in fact, we have a common goal. We're not competing at all. We're talking about completely different populations. The contraception need is in adolescence and in early adulthood. We're not promoting pregnancy in adolescence and in early adulthood. We're only promoting education. If we go in to say we would like to give IVF to everybody, please give us money, or if we would like to build a global network of fertility first point of care, fertility only, we're not going to have the resources. But if we say we want to educate people properly at the first point of contact about the two sides of the coin, that is a completely different attitude. So I think we have maybe missed the point in how we need to dialogue with these groups. And as well known, even the big donors will not talk to us for that reason. If you look at the population globally, it's still growing. But if you look at the fertility rate, it's plummeting. So there will be a critical point when governments will say, wow, there's nobody to vote for us. What are we going to do? So I think it's a matter of using the right language to discuss with the other side, which in fact have the same interest. And the interest is to provide a proper reproductive plan for our population, boys and girls, reaching adolescence, reaching young adulthood, when the need might change later in middle adulthood, saying, I want a baby now, we'll put a break on the contraception. Jolie has a question.
Edgar, that was it was an excellent talk, a call to action, and unlike most calls to action, an actual proposed solution for what we could do with that. So I like that very much. I have a couple of related questions. Number one, in the United States, we frequently are told that half of pregnancies are unplanned. And so I wonder if there are data elsewhere in the world collected by WHO or anything else that relates to that, because clearly the success of your proposal depends upon education, you know, and if we don't have that, we're not going to move any further than that. And secondly, you and I and others involved in NSAs in relationship and official relations with the WHO are very proud of the fact that we've accomplished, as Gamal said, the movement so that they are not strictly related to contraception, 90%. So now I think we've gotten that. I wonder how successful that's been, since you go to Geneva more often than I do these days, in terms of actually having a positive response from the various ministers of health, which is, of course, the way to get things done in the WHO. So 2 questions. Number one, percent of individuals who have unplanned pregnancies, and 2, how is that, if it is, being brought into line in the WHO?
Thank you, Jolie. I have no answer for your first one. I'm aware of 51% unplanned pregnancies, probably far higher than planned pregnancies. So I sometimes tell my patients, if you want to get pregnant, start belonging to the group of unplanned pregnancy, because it doesn't work in the planned pregnancy anymore. So are there global data? I don't know, but that's probably some homework in preparation for this dialogue that we should have with the contraceptive group, and I totally agree with you. We can actually help them disseminate the message and say, you need contraception, and it's part of reproductive care, and unite forces to discuss the same important message. Use contraception now and have a family young. In terms of the WHO, there's certainly a lot of openness in terms of fertility. There's obviously a strong lobby between the ASRM, ESHRED, they're not really an NSA, but they're still lobby, of course, ourselves and patient groups that are interested in lobbying. Funding has been modest. I think the budget is only about 8 million for the fertility segment of the HRP activity. I think there's scope there to do more, but with fresh thinking. I think we're still perceived as the don't talk to them group, as opposed to the one that can add another wheel to the car and go faster, I think. So that's where the work needs to be done, personally.
Thank you,
Thank you.
Professor Edgar, for this nice presentation. Our next speaker, Professor Sabaratman from UK. Professor Sabaratman is the Professor Emeritus of Professor Sabaratman, Professor Emeritus of Ops and Gynae at St. George University of London, Head of the department from 2001 to 2013, now Foundation Professor of Ops and Gynae, University of Nicosia from 2014. He will talk about the white elephant in climate change.
It's coming up. Thank you. Good morning, and thank you very much, Gamal, Professor Salakhani, the chairpersons, for inviting me here today to talk about. So Edgar has given a good account and tried to balance contraception with fertility treatment. So I'm on the same road, but I'm going to show the other side of the coin as well by talking about world will sink without contraception, which looks completely opposite. Because I thought Gamal's society is fertility and sterility, so the sterility part is not mentioned, so I thought I'll talk a little bit about that. So the idea here is actually two basic things I want to really emphasize throughout my talk. One is actually the world has only limited amount of resources in terms of agriculture or metal or whatever it is. The second is actually we have to respect the human rights of the woman. That is, if she must have a child when she wants. If she doesn't want to have a child, she mustn't have. And one of the problems we are facing is politicians are deciding on when the woman should have the child. For example, if the fertility rate is not going out in Turkey, for example, Erdogan says no abortions, so that he thinks he can boost it up. But the woman doesn't want to continue with the pregnancy. In some other places, there's no contraception. So I think we should, as a group, should promote voluntary, the human right-based approach for fertility and sterility or contraception. But I'm going to talk to you about the climate change issue, which is the burning point at the moment. And there has been a recent conference in Cairo about global warming. So I thought we should really touch on this. And I'm going to really start with the SDG goals, which was formulated in 2015, and the underlying word was survive, thrive, and prosper. So can we achieve this survive, thrive, and prosper? I will address that by taking some objectives for the talk. What is climate change and what is its relationship to health of people? The SDGs and its relevance to the population numbers, population increase due to increased life expectancy, population increase due to lack of contraception, and the population debate which we are having now. And I completely agree with Edgar that people who want to have the baby should have it, and those who don't want to have the baby should not have it, and we can balance it. And we have to take affirmative action to achieve this and bring back the memory of survive, thrive, and prosper. So this is the United Nations Assembly Hall, which they formulated the 17 SDG goals, and as you could see, no poverty, zero hunger, good health, quality education, gender equality. If I take the top 5 lines, if we can function properly in terms of balancing those who need contraception and those who need more children, then we can achieve these 5 very easily. But if we don't balance it, then we will run into trouble, because if it is excess population, then obviously there will be poverty, there will be a problem of hunger, we can't supply good health and good education. And gender equality won't come in because the politicians will interfere, and I'll tell you why they interfere as we go along. So what is it and what causes it? Well, climate change is long-term changes in the climatic pattern, and it started very much so in the industrial era from since 1800. And there is an increase in atmospheric concentration of the greenhouse gases, as you could see, the carbon dioxide, the methane, and the nitrous oxide. It has a steep increase, and what happens is these gases, as they are emitted, in the past, when there is natural greenhouse effect, there is no barrier for the reflected sunlight to go back again. But once you put into the atmosphere carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, it blocks it, and the heat comes back to the earth and causes the problem. And in terms of the potency, carbon dioxide, if you take it as 1, methane is 25, nitrous oxide is 388, and fluorinated gases is much higher. The reason I'm showing you this is actually because carbon dioxide has been the predominant contaminating factor, but as people increase, they increase the cattle farm, the animal industry, the methane level goes up, and the industry, when they increase, the fluorinated compounds go up. So we are in for trouble the more we industrialize and the more people want to have beef and so on and so forth. Now this is the proportion globally of the greenhouse emissions for electricity production, for example, 25%, agriculture 25%, and so on. But we mustn't forget the transport industry. Transport is 14% globally, but if we take Europe as such, it is much higher. It's about 35%. So there are country to country, there's variation in how much greenhouse emissions and where the sources are from. And this is an example of the Earth's rise, and if you think this is how it is going to go up, then you can see the Arctic area of the ice will shrink. As you could see in the picture, the white area in the middle in the last picture there on the right-hand corner. And as a level, the sea level will go up, and it has been mapped out by the trend in annual mean perception in 1901 to 84 to 85 to 2014. There are more climate disturbances, both dry and wet events. So it is natural that we are expecting more problem, and it is good that they had the summit in Cairo recently, because it has not only the potential of trying to deforest the area and cause flooding, but the agricultural crops and so on, the yield will become less, the water resources, clean water resources will become less, and health conditions will become worse, and infectious diseases because of the poor air quality, there will be respiratory diseases and cardiac diseases and so on. And if you take the eco-environment of the humans and the animal, we are invading into the animal territory, and the animal territory has a lot of microbacteria, which is in the middle, and as we go along, we will disturb the microbacteria, and that will get into certain animals and will be transmitted, and zoonotic infections will also increase. The typical example is the COVID virus or the coronavirus, which was published in 2020. Now, we must not forget the traumatic problems of mental depression and anxiety caused by flooding, and the damages, because the hot weather itself causes mental illness, but extreme weather can cause disruptions in social and economic environment and emotional distress and anxiety. So climate change is a major problem. So what is the answer? I think we have to think about universal secondary education. Edgar mentioned about education in various aspects of contraception and fertility. I think it's quite a good thing. But we have to focus on voluntary contraception, not something which is forced on having one child per family, etc. And not forced on not having abortions to increase the population rate. So, and maternal health services is another important, and smarter urban design and construction so that the climate change will be minimized. Now, I put this word provocatively, the world will sink without contraception. And we won't be able to achieve the goals of survive, thrive, and prosper because of the increase in population, because that will increase the deforestation, worsen climate change, and environmental disaster and zoonotic infection. So let us look at what causes the increase in world population. It's not only because there are more babies are born, but there is a natural increase because the people are living longer, and there's a rapid increase in population caused by unmet need for contraception, decline in infant mortality, and also increase in life expectancy. Over 65 years, there's 9% in 2018, and we are hoping it will go to 16% in 2050. And there will be more people more than 85 years of old. This is a map of increase in the population. As you could see, the steep slope. And they were expecting 7.8 billion in 2020. And as you know, recently we have gone beyond 8 billion this year. So that has on the increase. And so population explosion is real. And that will increase the need for food, more water, more energy consumption, and obviously this is going to have climate change. The top two, as you could see, is China and India, but followed by other countries, the United States, Indonesia, Pakistan, Brazil, Nigeria, and so on and so forth. So the population might get tripled in 70 years because, as you could see, from 1990s to 200 in a century, it has increased by 4 billion. So you can imagine if it goes at that rate, it'll be. But Edgar showed some films of anemia in terms of the countries which have not have reproductive level of fertility of 2.1. But this is a major concern for the politicians. If you take the figure on this side, left-hand side, which is actually the figures from 2010, the life expectancy was 74 for males and females was 81. Now this has gone up, so more and more people are getting older. And the right-hand map is 2021. As you could see, more people are living at an older age. So the governments are concerned that there's a high number of older population and their output, the economic output will be low if the number of younger people shrink. So they want to increase the younger people because they want more economic growth. As Edgar mentioned, they want to go for votes and say our economy is doing well. So therefore they are promoting. But the way they are promoting is actually like Russia. If a woman has more than 10 children, Putin gives a medal for the mother. In different countries, there are different ways of manipulating the woman's wishes, and that is not the way we should want to go. So this is the problem, that we are getting older population. So 2050, we think there will be 2 billion over 65, and over 80, it'll be from 69 to 379 million. Now this was possible by our own fraternity of medical people. Edward Jenner starting vaccination for smallpox, Semmelweis on antisepsis, and so on. Louis Pasteur, Hillman produced a lot of vaccines, Fleming, the penicillin, and so on. So there were a lot of success, which we wiped off all the diseases and vaccinated. So the life expectancy, which was about 30 years in 1800, became 45 in 1900. Now in 2011, the estimate was 80. And of course, the last 5 to 6 years, they stay in a stage of disability and finally frailty. And if you really look at it very carefully, communicable diseases were eradicated, then clean water, sanitation, nutrition came in, then antibiotics and vaccination, lifestyle, and infectious diseases. So now, at the older age, people are dying of chronic degenerative disease, cancer, and cardiovascular disease. This life table gives you some idea about the life expectancy of males and females. Females live about 6 to 7 years older in all the countries. But if you look at healthy life expectancies, again, they are short by the males. For example, the first column, of the 77 years, 7 years they will have disability, whereas in the females, 9 years they will have a disability. So that period stays on about disability, but the life expectancy as a whole increases, and we are getting healthier as we go along, and now we are pushing the barrier to 80s and 90s. And of course, females live longer because of the telomere length is much greater in the chromosomes of females. This was one of the Elizabeth Blackburn's research for the Nobel Prize. So they can repair the organs much better than the females. Now, talking about 225 million needs family planning services because they want it, but they are unable to have it. The same way, 80 million, I think, they estimate for women with want fertility services. I don't know the figures, but I believe it's about 80 million who want to have children. So we had to think about all this, and we had to think about the different countries, and especially in countries with more population. Now, India, for example, has 1.21 million. Compared to 6 countries put together, they have 1.1 million. So even if they have a fertility rate has come down in India, but if it goes up a little bit, then it'll increase the population numbers. This is to show the population in 2005, and it's if you look at how population increasing in different countries, you can see some countries are overtaking the other countries in population numbers. So we think the fertility rate is coming down, but nevertheless the picture is that it is still increasing gradually because of the absolute numbers, not because of the fertility rate, but absolute numbers in some countries. As you could see, India is moving so fast, it might overtake China in no time, because they have roughly about 27 million births each year. So that is actually the stage of increase. So some countries need more. So we can't reach SDG 1 and 2. The cause of famine is not only population explosion, but also the distribution, unequal distribution of food, which causes the problem. And maternal mortality, SDG 3, we had to achieve by 3 baskets of care. One is contraception, safe abortion care, and medical emergencies has to be tackled. So there again, contraception will be useful, and postpartum contraception is promoted for that. So the population expansion, as I mentioned, is decline in infant mortality, increase in life expectancy, and lack of contraceptions. All these 3 put together causes the issues. We are not saying that we shouldn't treat fertility. Those who need children should be given the opportunity to have the babies, but those who don't want to have the children, according to the women's rights, should not be forced to have children. And this is the problem with the population increase. You can start from 10,000 years ago. The wild mammals were 99%, but then we increased it with cattle farming, which is in 1900 became 40%, and 2015, 49%. This means the more meat we eat, the cattle or the beef, then it produces more methane, and increase in livestock also causes a problem, and as a result there will be additional layer which causes changes. So this is just a picture to show how the populations are like, and the housing which needs, and the environment disasters which are. And the people who are badly affected by this climate change are those in poor neighborhoods, those who are chronic medical condition, and who have reduced access to care. So the poor are made even worse, and we have to really support them by reducing the climate change. So the most vulnerable one, as I mentioned, is migrant population, greatest population growth areas, those who have chronic medical conditions and disabilities. So imagine this world, 60 to 70% is filled with oceans. And if the Arctic and Antarctic melts due to more human activity, the world can sink. And you can imagine some of the islands will go underwater. That'll be the Statue of Liberty, and as you could see, the Eiffel Tower, everything will be underwater. And so the case of one-child ethics is not so good, because that'll bring down the population very much lower. The 2-child family seems to balance it, but if it is the projection as it is, then it'll reach 11 million in 2100. So that thing we have to balance in between the two. And there's a changing tide of human fertility, which Edgar mentioned. And overall, the fertility rate are coming down to nearly 2 globally. So there is a problem there, but we have to balance it. Those who need should have the children. Those who don't want to have should be given the rights not to have. Now the issue about having more population. There are 2 types of fire here, and the one on the green one is sporadically, and the other one is man-made to clear the jungles. And how do we really know about that? And they have been studied on the greenhouse gas emission, and for natural problems, and also because of land use change and forestry. So they deforest in order. So equal amount of emissions are done by humans by voluntary action rather than accidental action. So what can we do? we have to mitigate. So we all think of electric cars, clean energy, and adapt by flood protection and so on. And I think the transition should be to low carbon economy, and that'll help because of changing food habits, because that'll also help in decreasing obesity, diabetes, heart disease, increase the fitness, and rates of cardiac and respiratory diseases also will be reduced by those changes. And this is the low population growth, reduced food wastage, plant-rich diet, and alternate methods of energy will be useful. But we have to also come to the point which countries are making the most carbon dioxide emission, as you could see here, US, UK, China, India, and Nigeria. Other countries are very minimal. So we have to ask those countries which they emit more carbon dioxide to be more careful what to do. And the family planning needs are not in all the countries. As this is similar to Edgar's picture, there are many countries you don't need that, which is in pale in color. The ones in black dots are those countries which needs in order to control, and they want it, but they don't have it. So that is where we have to, but individually also we can contribute by walking, getting on the bike, eating less meat, and reducing food waste and so on. And of course, contraception should be reversible, but voluntary contraception is the most important thing. So I'll finish it with these two lines and saying those who get affected by climate disaster are those who are the poorest of the poor. So I can say 1 million words cannot describe what's in the mind of these two toddlers. One picture was taken in Nepal, the 2-year-old sister protected by 4-year-old brother. After the other one is 2 brothers in a war-torn city, and it tells a picture. So I think that Martin Luther King's word is very appropriate. There comes a time when one must take a position that is neither safe nor political, but because one's conscience tells one that it is right. And that is to say, the woman's rights should proceed in terms of population debates, and the woman's rights should be respected. So the elephant in terms of climate change, there is no doubt there is some contribution by increasing the population, but we are not asking women who want to have a child not to have a child, but to assist them, but those who want contraception to have, and those who want a safe abortion care to have the safe abortion care, and not to bring in laws in order to increase the population. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this comprehensive presentation. Only 2 short questions allowed. Any question? Thank you very much. Thank you.
Sure.
Actually, I have a comment, actually. I mean, I have to disagree about the white elephant, actually. We're talking about the global warming thing. But what about actually the armored, actually, I'd say the global wars? And actually, I would see this actually as the true elephant on the earth. I mean, if we're talking about the wars and the amount of actually losses, life lost, and the environmental change like linked in wars like Iraq, Afghanistan, currently in the Ukrainian side as well, even with the consequences of the wars on the economic, the migration, and all the things actually. So I'm not sure actually if we actually defining the proper elephant actually within the room.
Well, I'll give you an explanation, Amir. That is, politicians, when they come together for climate change conference, they will talk about all what you have mentioned, wars, famine, economic downturn, but nobody talks about population. Because the politicians are interested in increasing the population in their own countries by hook or crook. If you go to Erdogan, he says no abortion because he wants to increase the population. If you go to China, earlier they said only 1 child, now they say 2 child. So the populations manipulate, and those numbers are vast compared to what is lost in terms of wars and so on. Because if you can imagine, I showed an example of India is 27 million births, and nearly 30, 40, 50%, not that number undergoes abortion. So it's not 27 million births, but also there is another 10, 12 million abortions. And that is not only unwanted conception, because there are a number of mothers who give birth with an unwanted conception. So I think it's a balance between contraception, fertility, and so on. But nobody talks about it in a political arena, because in the political arena, the politicians want to build their economy, and their economy is suffering because there is less children, and there's more adults or over 70s and so on. So it is going to be a reverse pyramid, and they will suffer. So they will promote, and they don't want immigration, but they want their own population to increase. So that is not spoken of, because that is politically not a good terminology to use. So that's why I mentioned as a white elephant, the population issue.
Arul, that's a great talk. No one doubts the crisis that you've stated, and in a poignant fashion, as I would expect from a past FIGO president, you've laid out some of the things. I have a quick question for which there's no answer, but I would like your opinion. And do you believe that we really can succeed with what we need to do for global warming without a greater emphasis on nuclear power? Because at least in the States, we're spending lots of times on wind turbines, we're spending lots of times on solar energy, even in the west portion of the United States. I don't see any movement getting us more than halfway to the number, the Celsius that we need to do, unless we turn it around and increase the nuclear energy that we have and get people like the medical professions and others to state that for the public. Because frankly, I don't think it's going to work. You know, and it's the only question is how quickly is it going to degenerate unless we do something like that.
No, I completely agree with you, Jolie. Now, if we can send the rocket to the moon and can send all the way to the Mars, and also send projectiles to deviate one of those asteroids coming and striking us. So all this is possible. So it is possible on a human mind to construct nuclear stations which can be safe. The politicians face a problem of where to situate these nuclear plants because of the public objections in the nearby. So they have to find some place where they can locate it, and that's the only solution till the time they build up. They can build up other sources as well, but they have to do the same thing. So I agree.
Thank you so much, Professor Al-Kumaran. Our last speaker for this session is Professor Gamal Sarur. I could finish here, but just to remind the audience that don't know him, that he is a chair of obstetrics and gynecology at Al-Azhar University. He's a past FIGO president. He is the director of the International Islamic Center for Population Studies, and of course he's the EFSS president. So Professor Sarur will talk to us about how to improve assisted reproduction outcomes in presence of adenomyosis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edgar. Actually, I'm in a difficult situation. First, because I have to speak after two distinguished speakers. Second, because I have to speak about a topic which had been touched upon yesterday by many of the giants in this field. Third, because I am a replacement for my dear friend, colleague, Professor Hassan Salam, who is well fed, while I am very, well, I would say I am properly nourished, but he is well fed. So please bear with me this. Well, the topic is that's how to improve the outcome of art in the presence of adenomyosis. I don't know whether there is an answer for this or not, but anyway, I'll share with you some information. Well, of course, I have no conflict of interest in this presentation, and during this allocated time, I'm going just to go very quickly for those who were not here yesterday, adenomyosis in infertile patient, and the pathogenesis of adenomyosis, and then how can we answer the PICO questions concerning improving results of adenomyosis. Well, it was mentioned yesterday actually by one of the participants that adenomyosis is the disease of the elderly people and cause bleeding. I just want to emphasize that this was the concept in the good old days before improving of the imaging technique. and we used to think that it is the disease of women who are 40 to 50 years, which is characterized by the presence of heterotopic endometrial glands and stroma in the myometrium with adjacent smooth muscle hyperplasia. But today, the concept has changed completely, and we know with the development of modern imaging that the disease is no longer considered as typical of women of the age of 40 years of age, and it affects 20 to 30% of women in the reproductive age. And we all know that there had been a global delay of the age of women at the first birth, and therefore at the first birth, and it is not surprising, therefore, to come across infertile women having adenomyosis. And in ART clinics, the incidence of adenomyosis is much higher than this, where it is around 22% of infertile women coming to ART clinics, they do have adenomyosis. And in order to find out whether we can improve results or not, we have to remember that adenomyosis is not a homogeneous disease, it is a heterogeneous disease, because if you look at the pathogenesis, it is either because of the invagination of the endometrial gland and stroma inside the myometrium, or it could be because of the metaplasia of the remnant embryonic cells, pluripotent stem cells in the myometrium, or it could be due to the retrograde migration of embryonic stem cells due to retrograde menstruation. And consequently, we have different groups of adenomyosis. We have adenomyosis of the inner myometrium, which is internal adenomyosis. We have focal adenomyosis of the outer myometrium, and we have diffuse adenomyosis. So we are talking about actually a group of diseases under the term of adenomyosis. And all of us are familiar with the ultrasonic picture concerning the focal internal adenomyosis or the diffuse adenomyosis or the posterior, large posterior adenomyosis with all the characteristics of adenomyosis. And of course, we are also aware that MRI provided an improvement in the diagnosis, and you can see here as diffuse adenomyosis with the surrounded with healthy myometrium, which separated from the inner lining of the uterus, or you could have extrinsic adenomyosis. With extrinsic adenomyosis, then you have a separation with healthy myometrium outside it, outside the adenomyosis, or you have intrinsic adenomyosis, which is localized to the external side, the external part of the uterus. So there are different locations of adenomyosis, and these are likely to affect the outcome of pregnancy in these cases, either diffuse or internal adenomyosis or external adenomyosis. So yesterday, many of the distinguished speakers mentioned how adenomyosis have a negative effect on the outcome of pregnancy and ART, including abnormal uterotubal transport and altered endometrial function and receptivity because of aberrant endometrial metabolism, altered uterine oxidative stress environment, and impaired implantation. And a constant feature in adenomyosis, that is the disruption of the junction zone and thickening of the junction zone. And this prospective study, earlier prospective study, had shown that when the junction zone is less than 70 millimeter, then the implantation failure rate was 37%, while when the junction zone thickness was more than 7 millimeter, the implantation failure was 95%. Also, another study had shown that with the contraction of the junction zone, when you have contraction of the junction zone myometrium, less than 3 contractions per 1 minute, you have a pregnancy rate of almost 60% or 50%. But when this contraction of the junction zone increases more than 5 contractions per 1 minute, then you have a pregnancy rate of around 20%. So there is a marked impact of the thickness of the junction zone as well as the contractility of the junction zone myometrium. And of course, yesterday, the distinguished speaker elaborated on the detrimental effect of adenomyosis on implantation. And as you see, several factors. And Professor Herrada, who was with us yesterday, summed it up actually that in the atopic endometrium, you have different levels of implantation factors and different level of pro-inflammatory factor, while in ectopic endometrium, you have decrease of the implantation factor and also increase of the inflammatory factor, which would account for the impaired implantation. And it has been shown that the detrimental effect of adenomyosis on post-implantation stage is not only the implantation but also the post-implantation stage, and this could be studied in this excellent study where they use egg donation in oocyte egg donation, where you have good quality embryos. When they were implanted, there was increased rate of miscarriage, which shows that in this patient is not only there is a reduction of implantation, but also there is a reduction, there is increase of the incidence of miscarriage. So to know whether we can improve results of IVF in adenomyosis or not, let us address the PICO question. And the PICO question means we are going to look into the studies which looked into the population and the intervention, and then the comparison of the outcome. So let us first take it one by one: clinical pregnancy rate, miscarriage rate, and live birth rate. A very early study by Versellini group had shown that when adenomyosis, in women with adenomyosis, 304 patients, when they are compared with women without adenomyosis, there was a reduction of 28% in the likelihood of clinical pregnancy and increased miscarriage rate. Then a very recent study came out from the group of Petraglia, who is represented, his group is represented here with us in this meeting, and they looked into 420 studies, and they have chosen from these 22 studies which satisfied their criteria, and there were 7 prospective studies and 15 retrospective studies, and this included 1,200 patients with adenomyosis compared with 6,500 patients without adenomyosis. And they found certainly there was marked reduction of the clinical pregnancy in this patient and women with adenomyosis as compared with women without adenomyosis. And when they looked into the miscarriage rate, again, there was there was a higher miscarriage rate in women with adenomyosis as compared with women without adenomyosis. Again, when they looked into the live birth rate, because it is the live birth rate which matters for the patients, and again, the live birth rate was lower in women with adenomyosis as compared with women without adenomyosis. And this is actually a very important study because they looked into almost all the previous studies till the publication was published this year. And the same study also looked into in patients with adenomyosis. Do we need to give a higher dose of HMG or not? It has was studied in 5 of those studies, and it has been shown that the adenomyosis was not a statistically significant factor influencing the number of the camulus oocyte complex. So in patients with adenomyosis, you do not need to give a higher dose of HMG, and of course we all know how expensive it is, and it puts a financial burden on the patient. Another study looked into, did a systematic review of the current option. Should we use long protocol or should we use a short protocol for patients with adenomyosis? And this study, when they compared long protocol compared with the short protocol, there was a higher pregnancy rate with the long protocol, and there was a lower miscarriage rate with long protocol as compared with the short protocol. So the message here that long protocol is better than short protocol for these patients with adenomyosis. Again, the same study of another study from another group, they looked into 17 studies, it was published just last year. They looked into not only the long protocol, but the long protocol, the ultra long protocol, the short protocol, and the combined protocol. And again, they found that if you are using the long protocol or the ultra short protocol, there is no difference in the live birth rate. If you are using the long protocol versus the short protocol, then you have a lower pregnancy rate with the short protocol. So the long protocol or the ultra short protocol, the long protocol or the ultra long protocol is better than the short protocol. However, if you are using the ultra long protocol, it is not different from the long protocol. So there is no need to increase the duration of treatment, which would involve more cost and more inconvenience for the patient. Again, the same also findings were found concerning miscarriage, where they found that there is no difference in the miscarriage rate between the long protocol and the ultra long protocol, and there is a higher rate of miscarriage with the short protocol as compared with the long protocol, and this difference did not exist for those studies with a mixed protocol. Again, should we give GnRH analog pre-treatment or should we not? The same study from the Petraglia group, it was studied in 3 studies comparing 760 women with adenomyosis versus 367 patients who received the GnRH analog pre-treatment, and there was no beneficial effect on the clinical pregnancy rate. So the conclusion of the group was that long-term GnRH analog before IVF has the disadvantage of long ovarian stimulation and higher gonadotropic dose in fresh cycles. And they said its use before frozen embryo transfer could be more cost-effective. And this last part of the statement actually is supported by this study, which had shown that when you use the ultra-long protocol concerning with the long protocol, you find that the clinical pregnancy rate with the live birth rate, there was no significant difference between the ultra-long protocol and the long protocol concerning the clinical pregnancy rate or the live birth rate or the late miscarriage rate. However, when this study looked into whether we are talking about diffuse adenomyosis or localized adenomyosis, in the diffuse adenomyosis, yes, the long protocol, the long GnRH analog had a significantly higher pregnancy rate than the long protocol, and the live birth rate was higher with the ultra-long protocol as compared with the long protocol, but this is in diffuse adenomyosis. However, the same findings did not exist in patients with focal adenomyosis, where the clinical pregnancy rate and the live birth rate were almost the same, and there was no significant difference. So, in order to make a message from this, you have to find out what phenotype of adenomyosis you are dealing with. Is it a diffuse adenomyosis or is it a localized adenomyosis? And thus, the ultra-long GnRH analog protocol during IVF cycle may improve the pregnancy outcome in women with adenomyosis, especially in women with diffuse adenomyosis when compared with the long GnRH analog protocol. And then, excuse me, then does it make a difference whether you are using GnRH analog in fresh cycle or in frozen embryo transfer cycle? And this was studied by the group of Park, and they found that when the, and they found that when you are using frozen embryo transfer, then giving GnRH analog pre-treatment is associated with a higher clinical pregnancy rate and with a lower miscarriage rate as when you compare it with a patient with fresh embryo transfer. And this is applicable whether you are talking about focal adenomyosis or diffuse adenomyosis. And this gives us a message that in these patients, that frozen embryo transfer would be a better alternative than fresh embryo transfer, whether the patient has a focal adenomyosis or the patient has a diffuse adenomyosis. And this study looked into the impact of the type of adenomyosis, whether it is advanced adenomyosis or extrinsic group or intrinsic group. And it had shown that you get the lowest pregnancy rate with the intrinsic group because obviously we know that this will have a significant impact on the process of implantation and the continuation of the pregnancy and the miscarriage rate. So it is important when we diagnose adenomyosis to know whether it is diffuse or localized and where it is existing. Is it intrinsic adenomyosis or is it extrinsic adenomyosis? Is it a diffuse one or is it a localized one? And this group, they indicated that a modified downregulation for 6 weeks could improve the clinical pregnancy rate in adenomyosis patient undergoing frozen embryo transfer, but does not improve the results of those patients in fresh embryo transfer, as was found by the group of Petralgia. And this offers, of course, that when you are using the pre-treatment before frozen embryo transfer, as Professor Jacques Donnet mentioned yesterday, you are reducing the endometrial inflammatory reaction and the myometrial contractility, as I have shown, how much the endometrial contractility affects the implantation rate markedly. And then the group of Tan, who is with us here in this meeting, they looked into the impact of surgery. Should you perform surgery on patients with adenomyosis before you allow them to get spontaneous pregnancy or you subject them to IVF? And they found that there is a marked improvement in the cumulative pregnancy rate. But mind you, this is for natural conception and not for IVF. So in those patients, then surgery might be beneficial. But you have to be aware that the risks of surgery, as was mentioned yesterday. And even they found also that if you give pre-treatment with GnRH analog before surgery, then you achieve better results with surgery concerning the outcome and concerning conception. Now, should we do cytoreductive surgery? Well, as was mentioned yesterday, cytoreductive surgery has its complications, and indeed, though there is some benefit from surgery, as had been shown by Professor Tan's group of adenomyosis, yet surgery should only be considered for symptomatic women and for women who have had repeated IVF ICSI cycle failure. And in this case, you have a reason to perform the surgery, but surgery should be performed by an expert in adenomyosis surgery, because not everyone is like Osada of Japan, because it has its complication. And you have heard one of the giants of our profession, Professor Jacques Donnet, he said he performed, I think, only 10 cases and he stopped performing the surgery. And if you perform the surgery, you have to be aware of the risk of rupture in subsequent pregnancy. And that's why you have to make sure that with surgery, you will have at least 9 to 15 millimeter thickness of the uterine wall, because don't remove the whole adenomyosis mass and you don't leave muscular capsule around the remaining part of the uterus. Now, should we use high-intensity focused ultrasonography? Well, for some people would advocate for this, but you have to remember that it's not suitable for every case. It is only suitable for patients with focal adenomyosis, and it improves the chances of spontaneous pregnancy, but it has a high rate of miscarriage and is not suitable for diffuse adenomyosis, and also it is not suitable for adenomyosis associated endometriosis or bowel adhesions. Now, should we use medical treatment or not? Again, it had been mentioned by Professor Donay yesterday. Non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs may help, particularly if the patient has symptoms, particularly pain and others. But also, as was mentioned by Professor Donay yesterday, that by giving oral antagonist drug, high dose for some time before the perform IVF, then you will be able to reduce the size of the adenomyosis, and you start the HRT therapy and do the frozen embryo transfer. So you stimulate the patient, get the oocyte, fertilize the oocyte, cryopreserve the embryos, and then do the 3 months or 4 months treatment with the antagonist, the oral antagonist, and then give the HRT and do the replacement of the frozen embryo transfer. So, Mr. Chairman, if I may conclude, I think the take-home message from this presentation that adenomyosis is likely to have a detrimental effect on ART results. And I say is likely because there are no prospective randomized controlled trials. So, we are just comparing, answering PICO questions. Secondly, that encourage early childbirth before the onset of adenomyosis, because the older the patient gets, the more likely she is likely to have adenomyosis. Thirdly, that early diagnosis of the different phenotypes of adenomyosis, whether by 2D or 3D or MRI, and it had been shown before that there is no advantage of MRI over vaginal D2 or D3. But of course, with the ultrasonography, you have the variable interpretations of the different operators, which does not exist in MRI. But you have to find out what sort of adenomyosis you are dealing with. Is it diffuse? Is it focal? Is it intrinsic? Is it extrinsic adenomyosis? And prolonged downregulation may not improve results. That long stimulation protocol is superior to short antagonist protocol. That no need for higher doses of HMEG, and so there is no need to add more cost for the patient. Encourage frozen embryo transfer after prolonged GnRH analog suppression. Now, excision of focal adenomyosis with GnRH analog pre-treatment, as the group of TAN had shown, only if associated with painful symptoms and repeated IVF failure because of the risk of complications of surgery. And then non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs may be helpful to alleviate some suffering of the patients, and that for diffuse adenomyosis, high-intensity frequency ultrasound is not suitable, and surgery is associated with risks, and if necessary to be performed, it should be done by expertise after prolonged GnRH analog suppression. So you may send her to Japan to have her operation. With this, I would like to thank you so much.
Thank you very much, my dear and great Professor Surur, for this nice and the practical presentation about one of the most difficult subject in our field. Two questions only please عشان صلاة الجمعة بس. Any question for Dr. Gamal? Okay.
Glad no questions. That's great. Wonderful. Thank you.
Actually, my question actually is, Professor, are you aware of any studies who try to quantify the volume of uterine adenomyosis in relation to the total uterine volume? And, or this can be a marker actually of
Not to the best of
tuberculosis?
my knowledge. Not to the best of my knowledge, but I am aware of studies which had shown that you have to leave at least 9 to 15 millimeter of healthy muscular tissues remaining inside the uterus before you excise it. Thank you very much.
Thank you,
So I
Professor
think we are
Saroor,
late for
and
Salat al-Jum'ah.
I would like to thank actually my co-chairs, Dr. Edgar Morcano and Professor Mahmoud Midan. And thank you for attending. And actually, the Friday prayers will be held, Salat al-Jum'ah will be held in El Patio downstairs, very close to the coffee break area. Thank you all for attending.